Okay, hello everybody. So today we're going to go through the initial setup of a QNAP NAS. So anybody in the UK that's familiar with Blue Peter, it is going to be a little bit of here's one I made earlier just at the start, simply because the first steps is largely a lot of clicking next with some personal preferences, and then you wait for about 6 or 7 minutes while it does its setup. So I took a screenshot of one I made earlier, just so that you can see every single step that happens, and then we'll jump into less of a sort of PowerPoint setup, and we'll go through the actual setup of a NAS. There'll be a little waiting for some of the features, but I'll try not to keep any dead time. I'll switch through and talk about a different feature while we wait for, say, a volume to format or something like that. So we'll go through the different options. And as Tom said, if you've got any questions on anything I'm looking at on screen at the time, feel free to just type that message in on the question bar, and we'll try and answer it either straight away. I might bring it out here live in the session, or we can talk about it after toward the end. Okay, so we'll move straight into the first action that you would do setting up a QNAP NAS. It's not essential, but my advice is to pre-install our QFinder Pro app. We have this app for both Windows and Mac OS, so that you can use this to go off and find the QNAP NAS, so long as it's powered on and has a network cable into your network. Even if the IP address doesn't match, this software will find it, and you can use one of these buttons here at the top to either log straight in and configure the NAS, or you can hit the configuration button and actually manually change the IP address, even if you're in a different network segment. So for example, if you've switched your wireless router and your NAS was set to a static IP and it's different for what your current router might be, this is a really great tool to gaining access back to the QNAP without you having to do custom IP addresses on your computer. It's just a really great tool, very little settings in it. You just open it up, it will find your QNAP NAS, and there's also different functionality within this that will do wake on LAN functions for your QNAP. So if you do have a QNAP that supports wake on LAN, if it's powered off, you can use this software to actually power up your QNAP remotely as well. So as you can see here on the first screen, I've got 3 separate NAS. The one in the middle there is the one we're going to be using today. The name is normally the word NAS, followed by what looks like random alphanumeric numbers. They actually match something called a MAC address on the network port. So you can see on the right-hand side that it actually reflects the MAC address that's over there. It's usually the last 5 or 6 digits from that on the word NAS. So that's how you recognize which NAS that you're setting up. So once you select the NAS, I normally go straight away and click the login button. When you click login, this is the launch page that you're going to see. It's just start the smart installation guide. On some NAS, you may see some other options there. For example, we have our new Qtier Hero operating system, so you may see information about that below that blue button. On this NAS, we're only seeing the start smart installation guide. When you click that, you get the next screen. So this is just asking you basic information. So you can change the default name of the NAS to something more recognizable, and you can set a password for your NAS. So this is me setting that up. I've called mine Webinar NAS, and I've just set a nice secure password of Webinar, which is rightly so telling me is a weak password. So it's very easy to set up the name and password for your NAS. So I will point out there is no default password with a QNAP. So every QNAP's default password is different. It's normally something to do with the MAC address of the unit of the NAS. If you've done a factory reset, maybe something like that, the default password is not admin or anything like that. So it's much more secure. Each NAS default password is different. As we click through, it wants to know how you want to set the time of the NAS. You can do it manually, or the default option here is the one that's selected to synchronize with an internet time server. If you were using this in an offline setup for, say, CCTV purposes, maybe you might not be able to have access to an internet time server, so you can input the time manually if you wish, or you can use the NTP server with a LAN-based NTP time server. The next option is to configure the network settings. For a lot of users, leaving it on the default of obtaining an IP address automatically may be the best option. As you go through the different options on a QNAP, you will notice that almost all of them have at least 2 Ethernet ports. Only some at the really bottom end of the range only have 1. So you can set up manual IP addresses, custom configurations on lots of different network adapters within the QNAP. This specific QNAP I'm talking through today, the TVS-882T, actually has 6 Ethernet ports on it. I'm just going to leave mine set to obtain automatically. Now it's asking you a question about what type of computers you've got in your environment. So whether or not you have Windows-based units or Mac-based units, Linux, and all that's simply doing is enabling a network language for your QNAP to talk to. The default is what you're seeing here. Windows and Mac are both selected. You can tick the Linux one now, or you can go and enable the Linux/Unix options later. It simply enables different services. So the top one would normally enable SMB. The second one would enable AFP, and the last one there for Linux would enable NFS. And you can enable and disable all three of these separately in the interface a bit later on. Now you get a summary screen of everything that you've gone through. So this is going to show you all the options that you've selected, and you can go in and edit any of them. So if you've made a mistake, you can either click back, or you can click the little pencil icon next to each item to go back and change that specific item's settings. After you've done that, it just gives you a warning that the drives that you've got inside will clear all the drive data from them. So if you are using drives from some other application and they may have data on them, this will erase those drives. The only time this isn't the case is if you were taking drives, say, from another QNAP and putting them in this QNAP. This wouldn't happen, but the wizard would look quite different. The wizard would recognize that you've actually put drives in that were previously set up on a QNAP, and it asks you, do you want to erase them, or would you like to restore that QNAP's information from the other QNAP that they were inserted into to this QNAP. So all the drive configuration and data that you've got for your other NAS would come over with the drives if it was one that supported our drive migration feature. And we do have a link to the website that will talk you through which models are compatible with migration from one to the other. It largely supports most NAS now. Usually the only restriction is you cannot go from a really high-end NAS with, say, an Intel or an AMD CPU to something with an ARM-based CPU, but you can always go the other way. So once you click OK, it's going to go off and do the action. So this is why I didn't do this bit live, because this period here can take 6 or 7 minutes depending on the NAS. So it's going to go through the options. It gives you a little bit of information that you can read while you wait for the 6 or 7 minutes, just different things you can do with the NAS along the top there. There we are, 99%, nearly finished. And there we go. So that's basically the entire setup, the initial setup of a QNAP. We haven't done anything with the drives at this stage. So far, all we've done is get the unit ready to configure, get to launch into the main web configuration pages. So I'm going to end the slides there. And now I'm going to switch over to the actual environment. So that's the same screen that we ended on with the slides there. So now you've got a couple of options here. This specific NAS has a T on the end of the part code, which means it's got Thunderbolt enabled. So any with Thunderbolt, you're going to get a little information about how to use the Thunderbolt connector. But most NAS, you're only going to get one button here that says Go to NAS Management. So when we click Go to NAS Management, it's going to open up the login screen for the NAS. So this main screen is going to ask you for the username and password that you set up in the wizard. So I'm going to log in with admin and my nice secure password there of webinar. So once I click login, you're going to get a lot of pop-ups here. This is going to tell you all the different functions and features of the different services within the NAS. So you can go through and read these. It's telling you how to use the storage and snapshots application. I can close this because that's exactly what I'm going to describe through today. A data collection agreement, just the legal stuff. You can scroll down and say whether you want QNAP to collect the data or not. And then you get a little summary here of your storage and snapshot screen. So within storage and snapshots, this is now prompting you to go ahead and set up the drives that you've got inserted. So from this overview, we can see I've got 2 SSDs inserted, and I've also got a 10 terabyte Seagate Iron Wolf hard drive also inserted. So one of the first things I'm going to do, just because it takes a few minutes, is I'm going to go down to the storage and snapshots option here on the left. And I'm going to create a storage pool and a volume. So storage pools are the most flexible way to set up the QNAP. You don't have to use a storage pool if you don't want to. A storage pool is like a virtual piece of storage on the NAS, and within that storage pool, where the RAID is applied, you can have different volumes within it if there is space to do so. Some people much rather just create a volume straight away and have the RAID directly on the volume. You can absolutely do that as well. It's just not as flexible. I'll go through the extra step of creating a storage pool. So it's going to ask you just, do you want to use our Qtiering feature? I won't go through that today. That's going to be covered in the next session that we have in 2 weeks. So I'll just click next without ticking that box. And now it wants you to select which drives that you want to be part of the RAID. If you had all the same drive, let's say 4 10-terabyte drives, you'd probably just click this box at the top, select all the disks, and then set it up that way. As I've got a mix of different types of disks, I'm going to set up different drives for different purposes. So here, if I was to click on the 2 SSDs, it's going to automatically select RAID 1 for me. So the default, when you select more than one drive, we're always going to pick a RAID mode that has redundancy enabled. So RAID 1 would be a mirrored RAID mode. We have lots of different ones. They're all grayed out with the different RAID modes because we don't have enough drives to enable any other RAID modes other than RAID 0, RAID 1, or JBOD. So the other options would come up. So RAID 5 comes on when you have at least 3 drives. You'd probably want RAID 6, 5 drives or higher. It will work for 4 drives, but generally with 4 drives, you'd go with a RAID 10. And we've got RAID 50 and 60. So we've got a lot of different RAID modes that's possible within the QNAP. So I'm going to just select the first one. I've chosen RAID 1, and I'm not setting a spare disk. So a spare disk would be if something has failed, one of the drives has failed, you can have a drive already inserted in the QNAP that's ready to just jump in and start the RAID rebuild, and basically get your data back to a redundant state without any human intervention. So if I click next, you get some options here for SSD over provisioning. So this is just a performance option. We do have a lot of information on SSD over provisioning on the website, but we do have a little information on the pop-out that comes there. Basically, by constantly keeping at least 10% free on the SSD, it's going to actually perform faster, but it will have less space usable. And you can also set alert thresholds on whether or not you want to be alerted once you use a certain amount of capacity. So I'm going to leave these all as default, just a little summary giving you some information, and then you can go and click create. Just another confirmation that what you're about to do will erase any data on those disks. So we're just going to click OK, and this will take a few minutes to complete. So it's going to create the storage pool, and as soon as the storage pool is created, I still don't have anywhere to put my data on there. So once this is finished, it should pop up a prompt that's going to say you should really be creating a volume now. A volume is where your data would live. This is where you would decide whether you're going to do a shared storage solution, so something that's shared on the network where multiple people can all access the same data at the same time, or whether you wanted to go down the route of creating something like an iSCSI storage. I won't go through iSCSI storage today either. That will be on the next webinar. It's a bit more advanced, but it's basically just storage for one machine at a time. So as this is going off and creating this, we'll just look at some other areas. So here at the top left, you've got a little pop-out that shows you all the pre-installed items that are on the NAS. So we've got the control panel there, which is the bulk of the settings to do directly with the NAS hardware. So in here, you can do things like turning the speakers on and off of the QNAP. So if you wanted it to be quiet, it's in a home environment. You can turn off the speech options, for example. Click apply, it's going to turn those off. It's only going to beep if there's an error or a warning. You can get lots of other information about the QNAP system status, go through and see hardware information, the specs of the device, different temperatures within the device, how much memory's in there, is dual channel memory working or not. So you can get a lot of information from the control panel, but there's a lot of settings and we won't go through all of them today. Largely the default settings for most are pretty good. If you wanted to do any customization, you can. The first screen, for example, you can force secure connections only. So if you only wanted people to access the NAS with HTTPS encrypted connections, you can force that as well. So that should be created now. So the storage pool has now been created, but there's no volumes within it. So what we'll do now is we'll go create and we'll go new volume. So you get 3 choices here. So we default select the thick volume option. One of the sort of common mistakes people make is they would go over here and click on the static volume option. And static volume is exactly how it sounds. A static volume is static. You cannot change it once it's created. You can use it or you can delete it. There's nothing you can do in between. So if you wanted to perhaps start off today with 10 terabytes of capacity and then later grow it to 20 terabytes, with a static volume, you wouldn't be able to increase the size of that volume on the fly without copying your data off and then copying it back once you create the new one. So a static volume is just that. You could create a second static volume alongside it to have the 2 10 terabytes separately, but you wouldn't be able to have one big volume at 20 if you chose the static option. And also things like snapshots are not supported, which is going to be a big topic for the next webinar. The thick volume is pre-provisioning whatever space that you select. So if I was to choose a thick volume and set a volume of 100 gigabytes, it would immediately reserve 100 gigabytes from the storage pool for that purpose. So I'll do that with this one. So I'll choose the thick volume, and then I'll create another one a bit later on for a thin volume and explain what that is. Here you get an option for which storage pool. Right now we have one storage pool, so it's only got the one option. We'll click next. Now you get to choose what you want to call it. So we'll call this main because it's the first one. You can choose the size. So I'll set this to be 100 gigs. And you get different options here for the maximum size the volume can ever be. And you've also got some advanced settings at the bottom here to enable things like encryption or pre-create a shared volume on a shared folder on the volume. So if I click next and go finish. So that's now going to go off and create a volume on my NAS. So it's going to format that volume, and we can see immediately the green bar is starting to fill up here within my storage pool. Because I chose this to be a thick volume, it's now immediately taken 100 gigs of the capacity away from my storage pool. So that's now creating. It's going to create some default folders and some other things. While it's off creating that first volume, we'll go and look at some other areas within the storage manager. So here in the disks/VJ board section, you get a full summary of the NAS, and whatever you click on here in the left-hand menu, you're going to get something that represents where that location is on the front of the NAS. So while everything is labeled on the front of the NAS, if I wanted to know where disk bay 5 was, when you select disk bay 5, it's going to select that in the picture. So you can see a visual representation of where that disk is on the unit. Same with the M.2 SSDs. It switches to a side view because you have to take the lid off to get to the M.2 SSDs, which are inside the cover. And so it's going to show you where each of those items are. So when you click through, you get some really good information about where things are. If you want a further clue, you can highlight an item and you can go action and you can click locate. If I was to click that locate button, it's going to make disk bay 1's light flash lots of different colors so that you can go look at the NAS and see which light is the one that's flashing. So if this picture of showing you where it wasn't enough, you can do that. You can also do that. This is more for people with a lot of QNAPs in one place. If you select the NAS host option at the very top, you also get an action and locate. This is good for Christmas time because this basically makes every single light on the front of the QNAP flash like mad so that you can find it in a big pile of different QNAPs. So this is really useful for our engineers in head office. They can find out which QNAP they're configuring just by doing this locate option. It only does it for about a minute though. And you get lots of information in here about the disks. So for example, at the bottom here, when I select one of my Seagate Ironwolf disks, it's giving me all sorts of health information, speed information, whether or not you've done an Ironwolf health management test. If you click on disk health here on that disk, it pulls up a lot of extra information, and you can go through here, you can go see all the different settings, you can actually run tests, you can view the smart information on the drive, and you've also got settings here so you can enable a rapid test. So if you were to set up a set of schedules for your drives, you can apply it just to this one disk, or you can apply it to all disks or just all hard drives. So you get a lot of information here, a lot of tests that you can run on the specific items. There's an extra bit of information you get when you select an SSD. You get to see the estimated life remaining of the SSD. So here you can see the SSDs that I've got have about 90% remaining, and this is just calculated by something that's pulled directly from the drive's firmware into the QNAP. So if you get down to a value of 0, we're going to let you know that while the disk hasn't failed yet, it's potentially going to fail soon, so you should be proactive and get that changed before it happens at a more inconvenient time. So it's really useful to get all this information from the NAS all on one main screen here. And there's a lot of info you can get. If you click disk info, it just gives you a lot more extra information, and you can check any extra features that it supports. For example, my SSDs support the self-encrypting drive feature, so you can check if they support some different features there from that screen. Now, if we go back to the storage and snapshots, we can see it's still creating default folders. Now, while it's doing that, I still have a hard drive in this NAS that I haven't allocated for anything. So if I was to go create a new storage pool, I'm going to this time select the one remaining disk that's there, which is the 10 terabyte hard drive. So when I select that, the only option for RAID on this one is single, because I don't have multiple drives inserted in here, but all the other options are available if you have enough drives. So if I click next now, it's going to ask me about an alert threshold if I want it. So I'll leave that by default, and I'll go ahead and click create. Again, a warning that whatever you're about to do is going to erase anything that's on the current drive. So you click OK, and now we should have storage pool 1, and then underneath that we'll have storage pool 2. So storage pool 2 is completely separate from the one we have on storage pool 1 with the SSDs. It's a different set of disks, and you can even get a summary of this when you go back to the overview of the NAS. You can monitor what's where, what's doing what in different areas. So it's really easy to go through and see what drives are a member of which RAID pool, different options like that. So we'll just let this finish this, creating it on the hard drives. Obviously, hard drives are a little slower than SSDs at doing this, so we'll just wait for this to finish here. Some other pop-ups that opened in the background were things like our help center, so I'll just stop that from appearing, but here's a easy way to access the help desk. So this is going to enable you to open up support tickets directly from the NAS. If you ever do have a QNAP NAS and you do ever have an issue, this is the best place to submit a support request, because it will submit everything along with your query. It will do logs of your QNAP if you allow it to, which can often save the first step. Quite often the first reply from our support to a customer with an issue is, can you send us the logs, because the logs might be a clue as to why that thing happened. Whereas this, the first step of you raising the query, has already included the logs. Okay, so we've now got the main volume created, and we've got a second storage pool. So we can see the second storage pool is empty. So this time we're going to create a different volume, but this time we're going to choose a thin volume. So we're going to choose storage pool 2 this time. So we're going to put it on the one on the hard drives with a lot more free capacity. And we're going to go thin volume. Now, the difference with a thin volume is you can set it to be largely any size that you want, but there is no risk of having to have all the storage up front. So for example, you could see that the maximum size of my storage pool that I have was a 10 terabyte drive that was recognized as about a 9.1 terabytes. So you can set this drive size to be anything that you want. So all the way up to 250 terabytes. So if I change this to a 64K drive size, I can go set to pool capacity to a certain limit. I could change this all the way up to 178 terabytes if I wanted. Now, I don't obviously have that amount of space installed, but if you know that over time, a volume that you're creating is going to need to be a certain size, let's say 50 terabytes, but today you only have the budget to put 20 terabytes worth of space in there, well, you can put that in there today. Now, the admin of the NAS is going to have to keep track of that, because all the users are going to see that you created a volume set to, let's say, 50 terabytes. But actually, your physical space in the NAS is only going to be 20. So as the admin sees that you're getting close to the usage limit, he may then have to go buy another drive and push it in so that he can have more physical capacity to match what the thin provision pool is. The benefit of a thinly provisioned pool is that you can immediately provision something to a department. So if you have a large enterprise customer, for example, they quite often have an IT team that charges for its services within the organization. So for example, the marketing team may come and say, hey, we need 50 terabytes of capacity for all of our media requirements. Well, if that's the case, you can immediately charge them for that 50 terabytes, but you can provision them a 50 terabyte volume. You might only have 20 terabytes of space, but you know they're not going to use 50 terabytes on day one, but it allows you to provision what they've asked for immediately. They think they've got the 50 terabytes. Now, as the IT admin, you would go and buy the hard drives as you need it, and you can add the space in. Somebody in marketing may have already asked for 50 terabytes, but in reality, they maybe needed 10. They over-egged their requirement. So if it's an overestimate, you didn't have to buy the physical storage to support it. So it's a much more efficient way to manage the space. So you can set this number to be whatever you want. So if I set this one as a archive volume, I'll only set it at about 2 terabytes here, and we can change different numbers around. And I'll click finish. Now, one thing you'll notice when creating a thinly provisioned volume is that the storage pool doesn't immediately have the big green bar used by it. So even though I've created this volume here to be a 2 terabyte volume, it doesn't immediately lock up 2 terabytes of space from the storage pool. So I could create 50 of these 2 terabyte volumes here in storage pool 2, which obviously will not fit within the 9 terabytes I have available. But it's really efficient at managing the space. If you have a lot of customers, a lot of users that all want 2 terabytes each, this is a really good way to give them all what they ask for. And you as the admin, you just have to watch here to make sure that the physical space, and the QNAP will alert you if you hit this 80% threshold, it will alert you that you've hit that threshold now and that you need to be adding more physical storage, perhaps through an expansion chassis or other ways to get access to that space. Just one other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to plug in a USB 3 hard drive into the NAS. So you can also manage external storage through here as well. So external storage is all managed through this interface. There's an external storage option down here, but it works a bit like Windows. When you first connect a drive, it's going to give you a pop-up to say, hey, we noticed you've added an external drive. What do you want to use it for? So here's the option. You can default select an option for this drive, or you can just close that. If I go down here to the external storage option, we can see that I've got a 500 gig USB hard drive attached, and you can do lots of actions with this in here. So if you wanted to format it, sorry, I clicked the wrong button. So here you can choose the format options, you can label the drive, you can even pick from any of these file systems. We do have an extra one, which is called the exFAT file system. You do have to buy a license. I think it's about $2 if you want to use exFAT. But we do have all of these different options that are available for you to format, and we do have a little guide here that tells you why you would use each different format. Mine's just formatted ext4 because I only use this drive with the NAS. But with this drive attached, you can do many things. You could schedule it as a backup target to back up content from the NAS to the USB hard drive. You could go vice versa. You could back up the USB hard drive into the QNAP, or you can simply just use it as a little extra space to expand the NAS as well. There's a lot of different ways you can use that. So now we've got all the volumes that are created within the NAS. So we've got the main system volume and we've got the archive volume, a thick volume and a thin volume. So even though that's 2 terabytes, the main volume still has all the space available because I haven't created anything else. Whereas the thickly provisioned volume was guaranteed its space, it's pre-reserved, it's ready to go. So now what we'll move on to is how do you use this space that we've created? So while we've created 2 volumes, we haven't really done anything with how the users are going to interact with that space. So if I click into the control panel, we have a whole section here called privilege. Now within the privilege section, this allows you to add users, user groups, shared folders, and do lots of other things like quotas and domain securities. We'll focus on the first 3 for now. So within users, if we were to create a user, so we'll go in here and create a user called test user. We'll create a password for it, something like QNAP. Yeah, weak password, thank you. Don't think I typed that one right. We'll just make sure. So, oh, didn't do it right there. So that's a nice, easy password to remember. Now there's options that you can do here immediately. So you can go through and add them to a group specifically now, add them to a share, which applications on the QNAP they can access. We'll go into that a bit later. You can even send email notifications to a user when they're created if you wanted to do that as well. So we'll create that user. Is it not liking my password? It just shows you it's a live demo. I think it's far too weak, so it's not going to use it. So let's say it's a test user. Test user 3. There we go. So that's created the test user account that's there. Now we've got a test user, we've got a lot of options for this test user, so we can change their password, edit the profile, user groups, and even which shared folders they can access. We can also add this test user to a group. Now I do recommend using groups if you have a lot of users, so 10 or more users, especially if they need to access different things at the same time. So here within create a user group, you can create a different group. So we'll call it a test group. And you can assign users to this group immediately if you want to. So it just added a space there, which we don't want. So you can add users to this immediately. We won't do that. We'll show you how to do that manually later. And you can also add this test group to which shared folders they can access, but we'll do that later as well. So right now we've got a test group, and in the group users, right now it will be empty. We didn't add anybody to it. So here what we can do is we can tick which users we want to be in the test group. So we can tick test user, and we can apply. So now the test user is inside the test group. So now when we go to a shared folder, this is the actual area of the QNAP where data is stored to the users. This is the folders that they're going to see. We can see a few default folders that were created, such as public, web, and homes. So within these different options here, you can change the custom ones. You can't delete the original ones that are created, but you can hide them if you wish. And we've also got the USB 3 hard drive that's also there as well. So if I go through and create a new folder, so we'll create a test share. So if we do test share, we're going to create that on a different volume. So I'm going to create this on the archive volume. So here is where you get to select which bit of storage it actually lives on. So I'm going to put this in the hard drive storage. And there's a lot of options at the bottom, again, for creating users and who's allowed access to what, whether you want encryption, recycle bin features. There's a lot of different options, but the default normally work great for most users. And we'll click create. So that's now going to create the test share. So now we can apply the different options here with the test share. So we can go here with the test share, we can go edit the shared folder permissions. Now what we see right now is we've got a few different users that do have access. If I wanted to add the test user we created to the test share, you would click add and you'll see the test user. You can also pick from the groups. So I could either add the user or the group. I would normally recommend adding the group because the group, if you've got more than 10 users, you can have, say, 5 people that are in this group added all in one go. You don't have to add them all separately, which is really efficient, especially if you, say, have employees at the company, new employees starting, old employees leaving the company. It's a very easy way that you just have to manage them in the groups. The groups are managed on the shares already. So by adding them in a group, they automatically get access to every share that they need to. So if I was to tick here, you've got read only, read write, or deny access. So I'm going to give them read write access to this share. So now we see that they've got the access to that there as well. So it's very easy for you to go through and see the different options there. So let's have a quick look at the questions before we move on here. So it says here, you are using QFinder Pro 7.2. The latest on the site is 6.91. That's right, the download link on the website is often quite far behind, but once you install QFinder 6.91, the app itself will check for updates off the RSS feed and it will launch the new one for you. Quite often the brand new versions that come out don't get added to the website link straight away, but anybody that's using the QFinder software will get a notification about the update for that. Somebody else has asked here, why is the first network DNS itself? The DNS setting on the QNAP is set within the storage and the network and virtual switch, and this comes from whatever the DHCP setting is. So on mine, let's have a look here at the main unit here. So the main one, if I go to the DNS tab, it's going to obtain a DNS server automatically. You can type manual ones if you wish. So if we were to go here to the information screen, we'll be able to see what DNS settings we were issued. So I can see the primary DNS server for mine is 192.168.50.2, which is different from the QNAP. Normally the QNAP will not be its own DNS. Obviously you can run a DNS server on a QNAP and do that if you wish, but that wouldn't be how it's like out of the box. We'll go through to the next question. Let's have a look. Somebody's saying they did select a static volume in the volume creation step. Yeah, if you do that, the option is you just can't change it once it's done, so you can't change that option. Somebody else has asked, what are the advantages of changing the sector size? That allows you to create a larger total volume. So depending on the sector size, there's a calculation that's done to how big that volume can ever be. Now, if you're going to be using a small 2-bay or a 4-bay, I would generally go with a smaller sector size because the biggest drive today is only 16 terabytes, and there's only going to be so large a volume you can create. It makes no sense making smaller blocks, which can potentially lower the performance by having the smaller blocks, by having such a big size limit, because you can never reach it with the drives that are available today. Somebody else has said, can you repeat what you said? Sorry, I got to this question late. I don't know what it's there for. So we've got two questions about what are the homes folders for. So the homes folders are each individual user or each user that you create on the QNAP gets a home folder. So if I was to go to our file manager here, oh, not the help desk app. So if I was to go to our file station and look at the homes folder, there we go. So if I go into the main NAS here, we've got lots of different options within the main NAS. So on the main NAS, you will get different homes folders for different options. So each user gets their own folder that's dedicated just for them. So if I was to go into the main folder here, we see home. Home is my home folder. And as I'm logged in as admin, I'm seeing everything that's just allocated just for myself. Within the homes folder, you will get different folders for different users. So once the test user actually logs in for the first time, they're going to get a folder created here, which will be test user that we created. So each user will get their own dedicated space for them to do personal backups, things like that. You can enable or disable the homes folder, and you can also set quotas on them if you wish. But essentially, it's just the user's own drive that nobody else has access to. So here, as I'm the admin user and I've logged in, I do have a homes folder, but this folder that I'm looking at here within homes admin is exactly the same as this home folder here. Only the admin user sees the homes directory so that they can admin everybody's home directories if they need to. Everybody else would only see the home option that's available there. Okay, so let's have a look at some others. How long would an SSD last if on 24/7? An SSD will last forever if on 24/7. It's largely down to the read and write cycles. So it depends on how many read writes they do, and it depends on the SSD. The best thing to do there is to go look at the drive manufacturer themselves and see what lifespan they give you. As reference, mine that say they have 90% left, my SSDs are normally inside my other NAS, the TS877 that I have, and they're in there as an SSD read and write cache, and they've been in there for over 2 years, and I still have 90% life left. And I've never turned my NAS off. Somebody else is asking here, can you change from volume-based storage to pool-based storage? Not directly, but what you could do if you have some space free is you could create a storage pool, create a volume within it, and then drag and drop your data over. But that would depend on you having some free space to do that, enough free space for that. But you can't switch and change it. You either went storage pool directly or you did a volume directly. You can't switch between the two. Okay. Somebody else has asked, why are we charging around $2 for formatting in XFAT? Without getting political, I think the guys at XFAT came to us and said that they weren't happy about us offering it as a completely free option within the NAS. We used to have it as a free option, and they just wanted a token gesture. For anybody that wants to use it, you can purchase it. It's a persistent license. We don't charge you $2 a year or anything like that. It's literally a one-off fee that we can pass the money on to the XFAT organization so that they can get a little cash for anybody that wants to use it. It's such a minimal amount that if anybody really wants to use it, you can get the license. It's an electronic license from the QNAP shop. So one of the last questions here, somebody said they have 2 10 gig network sockets on their TVS EC1080 Plus. What is the best network configuration? Both are connected to a 10 gig switch. So this largely depends on how you set up your switch or what type of switch it is. So within the network and virtual switch, you can do an option called port trunking. So that's here at the top. So as you can see at the bottom here, we do have the 2 10 gig LAN ports here, which is LAN ports 5 and 6 on this QNAP. So within this port trunking option, if you click port trunking, you can add a trunking group, and then you can pick your adapters 5 and 6 that you want to pair together. And then you get some questions. So this is just the wizard trying to make sure we select the correct trunking mode. We actually have 7 different trunking mode options. You can see them underneath. So this one's balance RR, so round robin. We've got active backup, lots of different options. So we do have information on the website about the difference between these. Now, if you have a managed switch, I always default to the bottom option. So this is effectively 802.3 AD. But if you don't have a managed switch, we do have the other options. So some of the QNAP 10 gig switches are not managed switches, so you may want to choose the general switch option. So when you click next, it's going to ask, now what's the point of this trunking mode? What are you trying to get? Are you trying to get load balancing, just failover? So if one of the ports was unplugged, maybe you're connecting it to 2 separate switches. So this is a really useful way for you to go through and select the different options. So you could say balance ALB, and then you can apply that. So now I've created a trunking group with Ethernet ports 5 and 6 on this QNAP. So that's going to go off and create it. So that's all set up and done. So that's set up as a 20 gig connection. So that's the best way to get the most bandwidth out of multiple ports. You could of course do that with all 4 of the remaining adapters, all the 1 gig ports. If you had a 1 gig switch, you could lump all those together as well if you wanted to. They usually must be done as an even number, so in pairs. So you can have 2, 4, 6, or 8 ports, up to the biggest QNAP that I think can have 12 LAN ports. So that's how you'd manage those different options. Okay, so let's just go through some of the other permissions options that we've got, then we'll come back to some of the questions that we have. So now we've got some different shares. So by creating test share there, if I was to go through and look at the archive test share we've got, so we now have the test share in the background. Let me close this. So we now have the test share that we've created, and so far the only person with access to this was the test user that we created. So it's very easy for them to go through and create different options. Now, if I wanted to access this test share, this archive and this main option is not visible to most users. Only the admin user is going to see that there's an archive and a main. Most users would just know it as one NAS device. So if I was to click up here to my Finder, go down here on the left to some network options, we can see all the different items that we've got within the network, and one of those is the webinar NAS that we created. So if I was to click on the webinar NAS, I've connected as admin. I'd already connected earlier, so you can connect and disconnect. But here you've got all the different options that we've got on the unit. So we've got an archive share that we created. I think this is referencing when I connected to it yesterday, because it's not seeing the new share. So let me connect again. Let me connect AFP. So we'll go connect as. Wait for this to come. Love a live demo. So when you go in the different test shares, you can go in here and create a folder. So if I was to create a folder, oh, it's not finding the NAS. We'll come back to that at the end. So that's any shares that you create on the archive are going to appear there. Some other options that we've got within the NAS. So if I was to go down here to, let's have a look here, go down to the shared folder section. We have the options for domain security. So anybody that wants to use the QNAP for an Active Directory domain, you can have it be an Active Directory domain member. So here you've got a wizard that you can do, or you can just type in the manual configuration directly. So within the manual configuration options, you can go through and see all the different options to enable it, or you can use the wizard that's there. Another really cool option, it's prompting at the bottom, is that this NAS can also be a domain controller. So if you enable the domain controller option, we have 3 separate options within here. So within the 3 options, we can be an additional domain controller or a read-only domain controller. So these are really great if you have remote sites. You can place a QNAP in that remote site so that the users that are logging onto the domain in that location, perhaps where you have no server infrastructure, they're going to get fast local authentication with a domain controller in their building. So they're not doing everything through, say, a VPN link back to the main office. The QNAP does that, you know, on a schedule. It's going to check a couple of times a day to see if there's any updates in the domain information that it needs to authenticate the users. Or you can have the QNAP set to be a domain controller itself. So if you don't have any other domains in there, you want to have a bit more of a comprehensive setup for your users in the network, this is going to allow you to set things like password expiry dates for their laptops, central control. If somebody forgets their password, you can reset the password of their laptop directly from the QNAP. And you can also back up and restore the different network configurations here as well. So if you do create quite a complex database, it would be important to back it up so that if anything did happen, you've got a backup so you can restore it very quickly. Okay, so I think that's everything that I wanted to cover for the session so far. So if there's any questions that anybody has, let me know. The next webinar is going to be on the 25th of June. It's going to cover in a lot more detail snapshotting, which is a really great feature, massive protection for things like malware, things like that. So I would recommend turning on snapshots, but I'll go through that in the next session. We're going to talk about Qtier, and we're going to do a demo on SSD caching, just to show the benefits of why you should enable an SSD cache. And we'll also cover the extra option down here at the bottom, which is our iSCSI and Fibre Channel app. So we'll go through how you would set up an iSCSI volume, what you would use them for, some different options within iSCSI. Largely everything to do with iSCSI applies to Fibre Channel. So anybody interested in Fibre Channel, we do support that now as well. So all of that's going to be covered on the webinar on the 25th of June. So that's 2 weeks from today. So anybody that hasn't signed up for that one, please do. The snapshot information in that is a really good to learn, and one of the best ways to protect data on your QNAP. So I'm just going to run through any questions that came in just now. So I have somebody here that's asking, can I migrate from a static volume to a more flexible option? No, this is not an option to do it on the fly as such. You can, of course, copy your data off, delete the static volume, create something that's more flexible and copy your data back. But that depends a lot on whether you have storage for that. Somebody's asking, can you go from RAID 5 to RAID 6 or the reverse without losing data? Yes, you can, to half of that question. So you can go from a single drive to a 2-drive setup. That would be single drive to RAID 1. If you add a 3rd drive, you can then go to RAID 5. If you add a 4th drive, 5th drive, so on, you can switch up to RAID 6. You can always go up the RAID modes, but you can't go back down them. So you couldn't go from, say, RAID 6 back to RAID 1, for example, but you can always count up through the different RAID modes. And you don't lose data, and you don't even lose access to your data during the swap. Somebody's asking how to install an app in the QNAP NAS. That's going to be covered essentially in our 3rd webinar, which is on the 9th of July. So we'll go through all the different apps and services. But for basically a quick summary, you would go into the QNAP home screen here, click on the App Center icon, and then there's a lot of different wizard that pops up. There's a lot of different categories on the left, and we've also got some recommended apps. So if you wanted to install any of our different apps here, like McAfee Antivirus or something like that, you simply come down here, click the install button, single click, it's going to go download the app, set up the app, install the app, and then let you open the app. So that's how you'd install an app on a QNAP. Somebody else is here asking, how can I block the admin password or change the password and the admin name? So you can't ever change the admin name, but there are a few ways to change the admin password. So my most convenient way, if you're logged in as admin, you can click the admin name at the top right corner of your web interface and go inside here to options. And then there's a option here to password settings. So you can change your password right here for the admin user if you want to. You can, of course, do it through the screen we were in earlier. So if you went into the control panel and the users section, you also can change the admin password right there if you wanted to, but you can never change the admin name. You can create another user with admin privileges, but you can't change the admin name itself. Somebody's asking, how can I set up the remote access to my QNAP? Great question. So to do that, you would go into the pre-installed application that's on every QNAP that we sell, which is called My QNAP Cloud. So in here, there's an option to get started, and it will start a wizard and allow you to pick the best method for allowing remote access to your QNAP. Some options may require you to open ports on the firewall manually yourself. Some options will do it automatically for you if your hardware supports it, if your router supports UPnP, for example. If there's absolutely no option to open ports either automatically or manually, then you can use a different option that we've got, which is called My QNAP Cloud Link. So My QNAP Cloud Link, it won't let me click it without setting it up. But My QNAP Cloud Link allows an outbound connection from your NAS to our servers. You connect to our servers, and then we do the go-between link for you and to give you a link back to your QNAP using an outbound connection from your QNAP. It's effectively a bit like a VPN link from your QNAP to our servers to create a tunnel for us to get back in. So that's that. Next question, is there a plan to release the QNAP OS to be used with different hardware? Yes and no. So we do allow the QNAP OS to be used on certain cloud platforms. So we have our Qts Cloud. So if you Google Qts Cloud, there is an option where you can deploy Qts in things like Amazon AWS. So you can launch it up there and have it without buying the QNAP hardware. You can buy a license to the OS and use it in a cloud platform so you can have a cloud NAS. So that's a lot of information on the website. That should be released fairly shortly. Somebody's asking, does the recycle folder and file station work in a similar way to Windows and Mac in that deleting a file is cached and recovered before fully removed? Good question. Yes, it does. So in the control panel, you can choose how this behaves. So there's a network recycle bin option here. So by default, it's enabled, and all files deleted are we have a retention time on those for 180 days. And it's going to exclude specific files, so temp files, things like that. But yes, you can have that set so that it's going to be done for the whole NAS for 180 days. The next session will also cover snapshots, which is also even better than the recycle bin. So I'll talk to you about how that one works at the next session. And it's really useful for Windows as well, because we support Windows previous versions with the snapshots. Somebody's saying, will this webinar be available to download? I believe it will be on our YouTube channel, and you should be able to access that via the links from YouTube. I think we might be sending an email out after as well with that. So that should be up within a couple of hours of the webinar ending. So somebody's saying here, we can increase static volumes by putting in bigger disks. Is that correct, please? No, a static volume is formatted to be, let's say, 10 terabytes. It's always going to be 10 terabytes. If you put bigger disks in, you will just have some free space on your NAS. So you could create another static volume in that free space, but you could never increase the static volume size. John says, very useful. Thanks very much. Thank you, John. I've used all the space for a volume. Can I reduce it to allow snapshots? Absolutely, you can. So here's just a quick demo. I will reduce the size of a volume. So in the early days, a few years ago, the option was to expand only, but now we've changed the option that used to say expand. The button now says resize. So if you select on a volume, so that volume that I have there is 2 terabytes. So if I manage that volume, there's a resize volume option there. So if I click resize, I can reduce its size as well. So if I was to say, change this to a new capacity of 1 terabyte. So I can click apply, it's going to say it's going to shrink. So all services will be stopped while this happens, but it's going to go off and shrink the size of that volume down from the 2 terabyte size to a 1 terabyte size. It usually happens pretty quick as well. So that's something you can do, and that will free up space in your storage pool so that you can enable things like snapshots. Somebody said, if managing multiple remote QNAP NAS units, is there a way to update the firmware, maybe through something centrally managed? Yes, there is. That is something that we will probably be covering in the 3rd session on the 9th of July. But if you wanted to go and try it now, it's completely free. It's a piece of software on the App Center called QCenter. It allows you to manage multiple QNAPs. They don't have to be in the same network. They can be remote from each other. You effectively set one QNAP as the primary one, and all the others report back to it with a little agent that gets installed on them. And you can install things like apps on them remotely, create shared folders, change their passwords, and upgrade the firmware for them. Somebody's saying, what can I do if I forgot the admin password? Every QNAP has a reset switch, so you can push the reset switch that's going to reset some of the default settings back. So it will reset the password, and if you have static IP addresses set, it will set it back to being a obtain an IP address automatically, so effectively DHCP again. So that's an option. If anybody doesn't like that there's a reset switch, there is an option within the settings to disable the reset switch. There is no way for us to recover your password though. If you disable that option and you forget your password, there's no hidden way for us to get that back. We just can't access it. We won't be able to get access to that password. You can obviously reset the QNAP completely back to factory defaults, but that, by removing the drives and setting it up again, but it wouldn't let you get your data back. Somebody's asking, is there any benefit to setting up more than one volume on setup, for example, for surveillance station? Yes, actually on my personal NAS, I have my surveillance in a separate volume. Because I use an SSD cache on my NAS, and I don't need the surveillance recordings that are recording from 6 cameras 24/7. I don't need those recording with an SSD cache to assist it. I would rather the SSD cache work for other things I'm using my NAS for. And the SSD cache, the only on-off setting you can do is a per volume setting. So I have a separate volume for my surveillance that is not part of the SSD cache acceleration group. So that's one of the main reasons that I do separate volumes for different things. But with the new software after surveillance station, which is called QVR Pro, which we will talk through on the 4th session on the 23rd of July, I'll show you how you block off some storage for your surveillance in that one as well, even without a separate volume. So there's lots of different ways to do it. Somebody says, I'm using my NAS as a movie server. Since these files won't be changing, would it make sense to enable snapshots? I would lose storage space if enabled. So the way snapshots work, I will cover this more in the next session, is they only take up as much space as the amount of data changed since your first snapshot. So if you take, say, 1 snapshot a day for the last 7 days, the size of the snapshot is only going to be the amount of data that you changed in the last 7 days. So it's actually a very efficient way of protecting your data. But if you're the only one with access to your server, you're not going to make mistakes, then yeah, by all means, don't use snapshots. But for that time where you may get attacked by malware through a computer or ransomware, something like that, I find the protection from snapshots to be invaluable. I would always enable it personally. It's such a small resource of your NAS, especially if you're only changing a little bit of data through a set period that you choose to keep your snapshots for. So mine, I do 1 snapshot a day for 7 days, and it works really great for me. Somebody's asked here, my NAS is placed in a closet and the system temperature runs up to 42 degrees C. Should I worry and replace the NAS to a more open space, or is 42 degrees acceptable? If it wasn't acceptable, the NAS would let you know. We do have some built-in temperature alerts for the NAS. Let me see if I can find those. So you can also change these options around if you wanted to. So I believe it's in Where is it? Smart fan. So here we've got the options to monitor the QNAP. So the smart fan is going to adjust different things. So there are built-in thresholds, I believe. If the system temperature went up to 60 degrees, it wouldn't like it. Your drive temperature is 60 degrees Celsius usually. You can change it to 70 for some NAS drives that will tolerate 70 degrees Celsius. But I find 42 degrees fairly acceptable. So if I was to look at this unit here and find out what it's running at right now, this is on an open table, so it's running not too bad. So my system temperature on this one is only 31 degrees Celsius. So I think 42 is not going to be too much of a problem. It's drive temperature I would normally want to look at. I wouldn't want my drives getting too hot. I formatted a static volume as RAID 5. Can I change it to RAID 6 without reinitializing the system? I'd have to check on a static volume about changing the RAID mode. I'll come back to you on that one, Luke. I'll get your email address from the report at the end, and I'll come back to you on that one. I'll try it on this test NAS and see if I can do it. And somebody says here, how can you reinstall a QNAP from zero? Good question, Jan. So if I was to go here to the control panel, there's an option over here called backup/restore. And at the top, there's a restore to factory default option. Now in here, you've got the reinitialize NAS option. So in reinitialize NAS, you can either set it to do a restart or a shutdown after it's reinitialized. Now, whichever option you pick, when you click OK, it wants you to type the password again. So if I was to type in our password, webinar for this NAS, even if you hit enter now, it's not going to do anything. You actually have to go down and click OK. And once you do this, it's going to ask you again and again just to make sure everything's OK. But when you do reinitialize NAS, it puts it completely back to how it was from the factory. All data is erased off the drives as well, but we do have different options. If you wanted to erase the drives, there are options to do that as well within our storage and snapshot manager. So when you're looking at the specific disks, there are options in here that if you wanted to do an erase on the disk, you can do that as well. So you can detach the drive, and then you can, once the drive is detached from a RAID volume, you can then do a permanent secure erase of that drive if you wanted to. So there's different options for detaching and disconnecting the drives if you wanted to do that. Okay, so I think that was all the questions so far. I think we've just gone over the hour limit as well. If there's any I didn't get to, I'll go through the questions again on the report that we get for the webinar. If there's any questions I've missed, I'll come back to you directly with the answers. Luke, I'll come back to you with yours rather than me guessing the answer. I'd rather have confirmation. But yeah, thanks a lot for attending, guys. I think we'll draw it to a close there.